Shana Tova. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My wife Barbara has often talked about my family's history in the Holocaust. This is the first time that I've given a formal presentation about my family's history and my parents' experiences of survival during the Holocaust. Growing up, my parents never spoke of what they experienced during the war. My home was really one of mystery and silence about what their lives were like during the Holocaust. And thus, over time, and well into my adulthood, I have pieced together the history that I will share with you today. I'm going to tell you how my parents survived the Holocaust in Poland in a way that may be different to the way many of you are accustomed to hearing. Many of you have read books or heard other talks or seen movies on this topic. I'm going to tell you how I learned about the Holocaust through my own life from the time I was a young child to my late adulthood. This by finding out what my parents went through. Most of what I'm going to share with you were clues that I picked up along the way throughout my lifetime and listening carefully to the occasional words of my parents. One of my earliest memories that I can remember is from my time in Israel. When I was about 3 or 3.5 years old, I recall to this day seeing the numbered tattoo on my mother's arm. I remember brushing the tattoo with my fingers and asking my mom, "What was this?" She said something to the effect that this was something bad that happened and left it at that. She never told me more for many, many years. I eventually found out she was in Auschwitz, but not what was her story. As a teenager, my friends would ask me, how could she have survived Auschwitz? Her story I did not learn about until I was in my 40s and 50s. To understand the story of my parents during the Holocaust, I must first share with you a little bit about each of my parents' lives before and during the war. My father only spoke in glowing terms about his world in Krakow, Poland before the war. As I grew up, Dad talked about his family before the war. He talked about himself. He attended public schools with both Christian and Jewish children and grew up in a home on the border of the old Jewish ghetto of Krakow called Kazimierz. By then, it was really just a Jewish area of town. It was no longer a forced ghetto for the Jews. He spent his childhood in a building built and owned by his family. After high school, he obtained a business degree from what is now part of the economic school of Jagiellonia University. By 1937, my father was working in a paper business that dealt in all kinds of paper goods, from toilet paper to packaging paper to fine writing paper. The factory was owned by 2 older Jewish brothers. When the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, the paper business was turned over to a German trustee. And I then first learned about the importance of toilet paper. After my bar mitzvah, my father sent me to Grenoble, France, to improve my French. I lived with his cousin Henri and his family. Uncle Henri, as I called him, one day asked me, "Do you know the toilet paper story and your father?" I said, "No." He was surprised and said nothing else. Uncle Henri grew up with my dad in Krakow. They were close in age and were close friends. But Uncle Henri spent the war, almost the entire war, in the French army. When I returned to Canada, my father, after I asked him, eventually into my later teens, finally told me the story of the toilet paper. The German trustee who took over the paper company, his name was Augustus Franz. He protected my father by insisting to the SS police who monitored the business that my father was too valuable an employee to let go, to be sent to his death or to the ghetto. I only found out the man's correct name this year when my brother found a copy of a German document in the Washington Holocaust Museum, signed by Augustus Franz in 1941, stating that fact, that my father was essential to the business. It turned out that toilet paper was important to the German army. It was part of the German war effort. The next year, the SS then tried to replace my father with Christian Poles, but they too said my dad was the only guy who could guarantee the amount of toilet paper the German army needed. My father always said he knew that most of the Christian Poles in the business. He always said they could have supplied as much toilet paper as the Germans needed. But Dad said they knew that being able to go in and out of the ghetto would be a lifeline for my father. He told me later in his life that he was able to furnish quality paper documents to the Polish underground to make false papers, as well as to get food and medicine. My father told me that Augustus Franz took many risks to keep him employed. He also saved the life of one of my father's Jewish friends. My father believed that Augustus should be considered a righteous Gentile. I knew little else except this story, and only because of Andre Henri, about what went on in the war till my late 30s. One experience my father shared with me later in his life was probably when I was in my mid-40s. I realized then that this episode particularly haunted him. Sometime in 1940, the Jews of Krakow were given 3 months to leave the city or to go to a new ghetto that the Germans were creating. My father arranged for his parents to go to a village called Wieliczka, which is famous for its salt mines. He thought they would be safer there than in a crowded city ghetto. He wanted his younger brother, Stefan, who was 14 and much younger than him at the time, to stay with him, but his parents felt the young man should stay with them and they would go with him to Wieliczka. In the end, after arguing with them, they respected his wishes. All 3 of them were murdered in Treblinka. My father always felt guilt about not being able to save his parents, and particularly his 14-year-old brother. He was never able to verbalize this sadness about the deaths of his parents or his brother until his late 70s. By then I was in my 40s. That sadness was always the elephant in the room in my life as a child and teenager and in my early 20s. My mother, like my father, grew up in Krakow. They were both born in the city. Pre-World War II, my mother spoke both Polish and German, as did my father. Krakow had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before the First World War, but they felt that they were Polish and their mother tongues were Polish. She attended Polish public school, again with Christian and Jewish students. My mother's father built and owned the family home near the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Her father owned and ran a large general store that specialized in fine foods and was well known in the city. My mother was accepted to Jagiellonian University in 1937, which was an outstanding achievement for a woman and a Jew at that time. The year she was accepted in 1937 was the year that the desk ghetto movement against Jewish students began in Poland. Some Christian students wanted a separate section in the lecture hall for Jewish students. By then, there were already quotas on the number of Jews that could be accepted to the university. These were called numerus clausus. Jewish students were to be allowed in the universities, but only on quotas. My mother only told my wife and me this experience in the university in her 70s. As a first year university students, she was sitting in the lecture hall at her desk in 1937, and a petition was passed on to her from the person sitting in front of her. The signers demanded that all Jewish students had to be seated in the back of the class. She was given the petition to sign. Obviously, she didn't sign it. In October 1939, as she was about to enter the third year of the Polish Jagiellonian University, all universities were closed to Poles, Jewish and Christians, by the Nazis. Around November and December of 1939, all Jewish businesses were taken over by German trustees, hence the story of my father. My mother told Barbara and me the story of her father going to work as usual and finding his store open and filled with German soldiers packing up goods to be sent to Germany. Her father was told he no longer owned the business and to get out. He never saw his store again. In 1941, all Jewish families left in Krakow were forced to move to the ghetto in the district called Podgorets, which was across the river from the main city. By 1942, deportations out of the ghetto began to death camps. In October 1942, my mom and her father were being walking up or loaded into a transport that was going to take them to a concentration camp. As she was walking up with her father, a German called out to her in German, and this is the only time I ever heard her say anything in German. He said, "Kommen Sie hier, Mensch." And she said she was frightened that he called her. He didn't know why he wanted her to come over to him, but the only thing that gave her some hope was he called her Mensch, since all Jews were considered Untermensch, subhuman. She went, and the German soldier told her to stand behind her. This random act saved her life. When the transport left, he told her, "Get out, go." She never saw her father again. She could not go back to where they had been living because as they moved Jews out of the ghetto, they closed that section of the ghetto. She had no housing left. She wandered around the square, what was left of the ghetto, as they shrunk it in size, and she happened to meet an acquaintance. He told her that there would be room for her to live with my father and his Aunt Berta. It turned out the three of them lived together with Uncle Chaim, Berta's brother. They lived in one room. Uncle Chaim had died that day. This is how my parents met. In March 1943, the ghetto was, as my parents would say, liquidated. It was gone. The Jews left, including my parents, were sent to Plaszow concentration camp. Life in Plaszow was much worse than in the ghetto. Those who have seen Schindler's List have seen vignettes about that concentration camp. When my parents were in their 80s, they moved to an assisted living residence, and while cleaning out their home, I found a written testimony my mother had made about her time in the ghetto. It was written in German, and I have a cousin who speaks German, and he translated it to me. It was about her time in Plaszow concentration camp and slave labor camp in Lichtenwerden, Germany. She never shared that this testimony existed with me. The testimony is long, but I will share part of it. She speaks of her time in the Krakow ghetto as follows. I was not accustomed to hard labor. However, I was drafted to work with SS Special Command. I had to help build barracks and unload train wagons. In Plaszow concentration camp, I was often beaten. In much such abuse, I was poked with a rifle butt into my back, and since that time, my back gives me constant pain. In her time in Plaszow, she spoke of working in terrible weather conditions with insufficient clothing. In October 1944, Plaszow camp, the concentration camp, was closed. Around this time, Oskar Schindler decided to move his enamel factor to Branica, Czechoslovakia. It was at this time that Schindler's famous list was put together. In 1985, at the age of about 36 years, a young married father of two, I read the book Schindler's List by Thomas Keneally. I was fascinated by the story, and I had read it because it seemed to have a lot to do about Krakow. And I asked my father one Sunday afternoon when he and my mother were at our house if he had ever heard of this Oskar Schindler. He turned to me nonchalantly and answered, "Well, of course. How do you think I survived the war?" I said, "I have no idea." I was dumbfounded. My father never ended up telling me much more for a long time. Leopold Pfefferberg, was the man who had gotten Thomas Neely to write the book Schindler's List and was also a consultant for the movie Schindler's List. He, in fact, had harassed Steven Spielberg for about 10 years to do the movie. It turned out that Leopold Pfefferberg and my father were close friends, a fact I never knew till my father visited us when we were living in San Diego about 2 to 3 months after the movie came out. I was sort of a bit anxious because I had seen the movie and I'd heard my father had seen the movie, and I wasn't sure what his reaction would be. And he said his famous line when I asked him in San Diego, all he said was, "The original was worse." I asked him, there was a lot written in the papers about Pfefferberg, Leopold Page, as he called himself in America. And I said, "Well, do you know this man? Have you ever met him? He was also on the list." My father said yes. He said, "Well, do you think we could ever talk to him?" So he took out his little book, long before cell phones, right? Well, looked through said, "Give me the phone." He called him. And that Sunday, we had lunch with Leopold Pfefferberg, his wife Mila, and my parents. Leopold was the exact opposite of my father. He had spent his life discussing the war, talking about Schindler. My father, even at that meeting, they would talk in Polish. I understand some Polish, but I missed a lot of it. But at one point, Leopold said, "You know, Spielberg is creating this Shoah Foundation, and you and your wife, can give a talk about your experiences. It'll be all in private. In fact," he said, you can come back another time. They'll pay for you to fly to LA. We can hang around, and I can even give you a couple of $1,000s each to give a talk if you want," because he saw that my father was saying no. That was the only time in my life I ever saw my father refuse money. He just would not talk about it. Absolutely not. On Schindler's List, my father is called Maurycy Pufeles, which is how his name appears on Schindler's List. But after the war, my father officially changed his name to a more Polish, less Jewish sounding name, Marian Poleski, hence my name. Unfortunately, my mother was not able to get on the list. One reason was that she and my father were not married, or as she would say, that was the way things were at that time. She didn't speak much about it either, and my father did most of the talking, and none of it was about the war. They also, at that time, rarely saw each other because once they were sent to the Plaszow concentration camp, men and women lived in separate concentration camp barracks. My mother was sent to Auschwitz from Plaszow concentration camp. She arrived in Auschwitz on October 17th, 1944. She was 27 years old. In her 80s, my mom opened up to my wife Barbara for the first time about the details of her time in Auschwitz. She spoke about Dr. Mengele and being chosen to live. She spoke about being tattooed with a number that was visible on her arm till the day she died. She always tended to try to see the good in people. Even in the midst of the horror of the time, my mom remarked to Barbara that the man who branded her with a number tattoo was kind to her and did it quickly with small numbers. After 3 weeks in Auschwitz, sleeping on bare floors, doing heavy labor, and suffering from intense exhaustion, she was sent with 300 other women to a slave labor camp in Sudetenland, Germany, to make uniforms. My mother survived the work camp until liberation by the Russians on the last day of the war, in May 1945. At her liberation, she weighed 90 pounds, skeletal. She stood at 5'9" in her youth. She managed to return to Krakow on foot with other refugees, occasionally getting rides here and there. She went to her family home in Krakow, only to find other families were living there. She was told she could not return to her flat on the second floor. Luckily, one of the Christian tenants who had lived in the building for many years recognized her and took her in to stay with him and his family. My father was liberated on May 8th, 1945 by Russian soldiers. When he returned to Krakow, he kept coming back to where my mother had lived, hoping to find her. He had gotten to Krakow long before my mother did. They finally reunited and married, and I was born a few years later in Krakow. Like many displaced Jews post-World War II, my parents tried to reconstruct their lives in Krakow, Poland, but life was difficult. Their Poland of their youth was gone. They decided to leave and go to Israel, the only country that Jews were being immediately accepted to. On leaving Poland, the communist government forced them to give up their Polish citizenship. My family lived in Israel for about 2 years before immigrating to Montreal, Canada. I think that was always the plan. It took time, but they obtained a visa sponsored by my father's cousin who lived in Montreal. In Canada, my parents rebuilt their lives. They had a second child, my brother Stephen, who was born 8 years after me. My parents built a life and family in Canada. There was always a sadness for me that they carried memories from their lives that they never felt they could talk to about to me or my brother. I understand they wanted to protect my brother and I from the horrors they had witnessed. As parent and now grandparents, I think I now understand how difficult that must have been for them. My father passed away in March 2002 at the age of 89, and my mother, Teresa, passed away in March 2013 at the age of 95. I know that their experiences during the war have affected me and influenced me and how I look at the world. However, my father always said to me that one thing that cannot be taken from you is your knowledge or your mind. My parents left me with lessons about the importance of education. They also taught me to appreciate our freedom, to live in a democracy, and to recognize that there is good in people, irrespective of their race or religion, nationality, or ethnicity, despite what they went through. They recognized the people who took risks and contributed to their survival during one of the darkest times in modern history. I have a photo of my brother and I and our collective 6 children surrounded by my parents. This photograph was taken in early 2000, a couple of years before my father's death. In this photo, my parents are beaming with happiness and pride. To me, their smiles are a celebration and a testament to all they achieved. They left me with a foundation of family and living my life to be devoted to trying to do the right thing. This is a legacy I hope to impart. I have imparted to my 3 children and will be shared by my 4 grandchildren. Thank you for listening.